Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we try to cut through the historical noise and bring you the essential insights.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a conflict that, well, despite claiming millions of lives and really shaping the geopolitical landscape for decades, often doesn't quite get the attention it deserves.
That's right. We're talking about the Korean War.
Exactly. A brutal three-year struggle, 1950 to 1953, that left a peninsula still divided by this incredibly heavily fortified border we see today.
A division that's still a major flashpoint.
Absolutely. And for you listening, this deep dive is, we hope, a shortcut to understanding one of the most pivotal conflicts of the whole Cold War era.
We're going to try and connect those historical dots, maybe uncover some key players you weren't familiar with, and really explore the why behind what might just seem like old headlines now.
Yeah, get ready for, hopefully, some genuine aha moments as we dig into our sources here.
It's a stark reality, isn't it? A war that technically never really ended. Its ripples are still felt, 70 years later?
It's incredible.
Our mission today is to unravel not just what happened, but crucially, why it happened. Who were the primary combatants? How did this war that cost millions of lives end up with such an enduring, painful division?
And we'll be navigating through the historical sources provided, looking for those crucial nuggets of insight that, illuminate this really complex story.
Definitely complex.
So what's ahead for us? We'll start by trying to understand the fractured landscape left right after World War II. Then we'll trace the initial invasion, the North Korean invasion, and the world's pretty dramatic response.
Then we follow the war's evolution, the intense fighting, the critical international interventions.
Right, China's entry, the UN response, and finally we'll grapple with those bitter negotiations and the unresolved legacy that continues to shape global politics, especially, in East Asia.
A lot to cover.
Okay, so to truly grasp why the Korean War ignited, we have to rewind back to the immediate aftermath of World War II.
Right. The sources are pretty clear that the immediate origins lie in the collapse of the Japanese Empire, September 1945.
But this wasn't just any colonial collapse, was it? Korea's situation was profoundly unique.
It really was. What stands out is that, unlike many other former colonies, think China, or maybe some Western colonies in Southeast Asia where you often had established native governments in exile, or clear indigenous leaders ready to step in.
Right, some existing structure.
Exactly. Korea had been outright annexed by Japan since 1910. So there was no pre-existing unifying political force just waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
When the Japanese withdrew, it created this huge political vacuum, a void, and various factions immediately tried to fill it.
So this wasn't about simply restoring an old order, which would have been complicated enough.
Not at all. Yeah.
Instead, it was about building a new nation, basically from scratch, but doing it in a global climate that was already deeply fractured by these new ideological tensions, right, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Precisely. The emerging superpowers, that unique combination, the vacuum plus the Cold War backdrop, really set the stage for a divergent future for Korea.
How so? How did that play out on the ground?
Well, it meant the seeds of internal conflict were sown even before, the U.S. and Soviets really dug in and hardened the divide.
Right.
The claimants to power, the potential leaders, were largely exiles, and they fell into two very distinct, very opposing categories.
Right, the sources mentioned this clearly.
On one side, you had Marxist revolutionaries, people like Kim Il-sung. He was actually a highly effective guerrilla leader, fought the Japanese alongside Chinese-dominated armies, got training in Russia.
He was even a major in the Soviet army, wasn't he?
That's right. He represented a vision of a unified communist Korea.
Okay, so that's one side. And the other?
On the other side, the sources describe them as ultranationalists, often inspired by Western ideas, science, industrialism. Figures like Syngman Rhee were central here.
Syngman Rhee, educated in the U.S.?
He'd been president of a dissident Korean provisional government while in exile. So you see, this wasn't just a political disagreement. It was fundamental, a clash over Korea's very soul, its future identity.
And heavily influenced, amplified even, by these external powers.
Absolutely. Imagine you're a country emerging from decades of brutal occupation. You're desperate for leadership.
Yeah.
And you find two entirely different, deeply entrenched ideologies vying for control. It was, almost inevitably a recipe for division.
And this division, it became concrete pretty quickly, didn't it? With something that started out sounding quite administrative.
You mean the 38th parallel?
Exactly, that line on the map.
Yeah. In August 1945, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Korea at that latitude line. Initially, it was presented as purely administrative.
Just logistics.
Pretty much. To disarm the Japanese forces still there and to handle the repatriation of the Japanese population, maybe around 700,000 people, the U.S. certainly seemed to view it as temporary.
But it didn't stay temporary for long. This is like a really crucial pivot point in the story, isn't it?
It really is. What started as a temporary expedient, a line for logistical convenience, quickly calcified. It became a political boundary.
How did that happen so fast?
Well, the Soviets almost immediately began what our sources call a short-lived reign of terror in their zone, north of the parallel. That act alone rapidly politicized the division.
Ah, so it wasn't just administrative anymore.
Not at all. It drove thousands of refugees south, across that arbitrary line, and it hardened what was meant to be a temporary border into a de facto frontier.
And the two sides, backed by their patrons, the U.S. and the Soviets, they just couldn't agree.
They couldn't agree on a formula that would produce a unified Korea. Nope. And this failure to unite then led pretty quickly to the rapid militarization of both sides.
Okay, so distrust builds, the division hardens, and then come the armies.
Exactly. By 1947, down in the South, which was still under nominal U.S. control until 48, the National Police and the Constabulary had doubled to about 80,000 personnel.
And in the North.
Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung was consolidating his control over the Communist Party, the administrative structure, and crucially, his military forces, the Korean People's Army, the KPA.
How strong was the KPA by then?
It reached about 100,000 by 1948, and it was significantly reinforced by southern Korean guerrillas who'd gone north, plus experienced Korean veterans returning from the Chinese People's Liberation Army.
So you have this rapid buildup on both sides, fueled by ideology, fueled by external backing.
It created an incredibly unstable situation. These weren't just peacekeeping forces, these were armies actively preparing for conflict.
And the violence didn't wait for June 1950, did it? The sources talk about significant unrest and clashes well before the main invasion.
Oh, absolutely. A period of devastating pre-war bloodshed between 1948 and 1950.
What triggered that specific period?
Well, the creation of an independent South Korea, the Republic of Korea, ROK, in August 1948 with Syngman Rhee as president. This became official UN policy.
And the communists in the South didn't accept that.
Fiercely opposed it. This led to widespread partisan warfare. It basically engulfed parts of every single Korean province below the 38th parallel by the autumn of 48.
Wow, so internal fighting was already widespread.
And it quickly expanded into a limited border war between the ROK Army, the ROK and the North Korean Border Constabulary, and the KPA.
There were actual cross-border attacks.
Yes. The North launched 10 documented cross-border guerrilla incursions. The goal seems to have been to draw ROK units away from their counter-guerrilla efforts in the South.
This period must have seen immense suffering internally.
Huge suffering. It wasn't a clean start to independence. It was a civil war already simmering. Thousands of lives lost before the main war even began.
The sources give numbers, don't they? Almost 8,000 South Korean security forces.
And at least 30,000 other Koreans died during this pre-war period. Many weren't even combatants, just people identified as rightists or Reds by one side or the other.
So brutal. Small-scale atrocities were just common.
They became a brutal way of life. It really highlights the deeply personal nature of this ideological struggle on the ground.
So the conflict didn't just explode overnight in 1950?
Not at all. Years in the making. A culmination of deep internal strife, fierce ideological polarization, and now these growing armies facing each other.
And critically, this partisan war in the South, it hampered the South Korean Army's readiness, right?
Severely delayed their training. By early 1950, American advisors judged that fewer than half, less than half, of the RK's infantry battalions were even marginally ready for a conventional war.
And U.S. military aid wasn't exactly top of the line either.
Largely surplus light weapons and supplies, which, further signaled weakness to the North.
And this perceived weakness, it wasn't just a minor detail.
No, it was critical, a critical factor for the North. Even General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the U.S. Far East Command.
Yeah.
He argued that his own 8th Army in Japan, just 4 pretty weak divisions, needed more support than the Koreans were getting.
Wow. So it wasn't just a weakness, but a perceived vulnerability that kind of became the spark.
Exactly. A miscalculation, perhaps, of U.S. commitment or capability. It created an opening, a perceived window of opportunity for Kim Il-sung to try and realize his vision of unifying Korea under communism by force.
Right. So the stage is tragically set. Early clashes, deep ideological divides, two armies readying themselves, and a perception of weakness in the South. The conflict is about to explode into its next, really devastating phase, the full-scale invasion.
And the global response that followed.
North Korea's blitzkrieg, it was meticulously planned, wasn't it? The sources show Kim Il-sung was pushing Stalin for this invasion as early as 1949.
He was. But initially, Stalin actually refused. He was concerned about the North's preparedness and, probably more importantly, the very real fear of U.S. involvement.
So what changed?
Well, over the next year, the communist leadership in the North worked like crazy to build the KPA into a truly formidable offensive force.
Modeled on the Soviet army.
Yes, a Soviet mechanized army model. The Chinese released thousands of experienced Korean veterans from their own People's Liberation Army to join the KPA.
And the Soviets provided the hardware.
Poured in armaments, tanks, artillery, aircraft. By 1950, the North Koreans actually had substantial advantages over the South in almost every category of equipment.
So Kim goes back to Moscow in April 1950.
And this time, Stalin approves the invasion. This wasn't spontaneous. It was a deliberate, calculated decision to start a conventional war, with crucial backing from the big communist powers.
The planning, the resource allocation, it really underscores the strategic thinking behind the North's gamble.
It does. And then, crack of dawn, June 25th, 1950, the invasion kicks off.
How did it unfold initially?
Massive two-pronged offensive across the 38th parallel. A powerful thrust towards Seoul in the west and another push down the east coast, aiming to just overwhelm the South's defenses quickly.
And they took Seoul fairly quickly.
Yeah, the KPA entered Seoul on the afternoon of June 28th, but crucially, they failed to achieve their primary goal.
Which was?
A quick surrender from Syngman Rhee's government or the total disintegration of the South Korean army. That didn't happen.
So the RKA held together somewhat.
Remnants of the RKA forces near Seoul managed to form a defensive line south of the Han River. And on the east coast, RKA units, though they gave ground, did so in relatively good order.
But this unexpected resilience, it meant the South desperately needed help.
Yeah.
Right, to avoid collapse.
Urgently needed help. And that's when the world reacted. With remarkable speed, actually.
Truman's first moves.
Initially, he ordered MacArthur to get munitions to the RKA and use U.S. air cover to protect the evacuation of American citizens.
But he didn't go straight to Congress for war.
No, he saw that as potentially too alarmist, too time-consuming. Instead, very strategically, he went to the United Nations for sanction.
A critical move.
Absolutely. Under U.S. guidance, the UN Security Council moved fast. June 25th called for the invasion to halt. June 27th called for member states to provide military assistance to the RK.
And the Soviets couldn't stop it.
This is the crucial detail, often overlooked. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council at that exact moment.
Why?
Over the issue of admitting Communist China to the UN.
So they weren't there to use their veto.
Exactly. A massive diplomatic miscalculation on their part. It allowed the UN, effectively led by the U.S. on this issue, to legitimize military intervention.
So Cold War politics, even a boycott, directly shaped the international response.
Fundamentally. And back in the U.S., public and congressional opinion was solidly behind intervention. No significant dissent early on, but
Having the political will and having the troops on the ground ready to go are two different things.
oh, absolutely. The Truman administration faced that unhappy truth. They lacked immediate, effective military power to stop the invasion right then and there.
MacArthur committed troops from Japan.
3 divisions. But initially, the U.S. ground forces arriving they expanded the scope of defeat, frankly.
Wait, how bad was it early on?
For almost 8 weeks, from near Osan, down past the Kum River, Taijin, south towards Daegu, U.S. soldiers fought, died, and sometimes, yes, they fled. It was desperate.
What were the main problems?
Inadequate weapons, especially against North Korean tanks initially, limited numbers, uncertain leadership in some units, and the chaos was amplified by streams of refugees heading south.
Which also increased the risk of guerrilla infiltration behind the lines.
Exactly. And tragically, these desperate conditions led to horrifying attacks on Korean civilians. on both sides.
The sources mention Taishan.
Yes, South Korean paramilitary forces massacred thousands of civilians and suspected communists at Taizhen, a war crime that was actually blamed on the North Koreans for decades.
And Nogunri.
And at Nogunri, U.S. troops and aircraft fired on refugees, killing hundreds. These atrocities, right from the start, underscore the brutal reality of this war.
So when did things start to turn around, even slightly?
Not until the first weeks of August. That's when the United Nations Command, the UNC, started to slow the North Koreans down.
Under whose command specifically?
The 8th Army was led by Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker, and the ROKA by Major General Chung Il-kwon. They began to rally, fight back more effectively.
And supplies started getting through.
Crucially, yes, supplies poured through the port at Busan. The 8th Army's logistics system there depended heavily on Korean and Japanese technicians, plus thousands of Korean laborers. It was a massive effort.
What kind of military buildup happened then?
A significant one. To stop the North Korean tanks, artillery, infantry, the UNC brought in Sherman and Pershing medium tanks, better rocket launchers, more artillery,
And air power.
vital close air support. The U.S. Air Force used P-51 Mustangs, but also new jets, F-80s, F-84s, plus B-26 and B-29 bombers hitting KPA forward units.
Marine Corps Aviation, too.
Yeah, Marine squadrons flying off Navy light carriers provided quick air response, and U.S. Navy warships acted like seagoing heavy artillery, especially supporting RKO units along the East Coast.
And more ground troops arrived.
Fresh U.S. Army and Marine units started landing, supplemented by a British Commonwealth brigade. And the RKA, which had shrunk drastically, began rebuilding its ranks, reservists, student volunteers, conscripts.
So a brutal race against time, the initial vulnerability, then this rapid, desperate buildup of UN forces.
Exactly, and it all came down to holding that final line.
The Busan perimeter.
Right. The KPA's final push against the Naktung River Taegu-Yungduk line, the Busan perimeter, ultimately failed.
Was there a key battle?
The Battle of Tabu-dong was pretty decisive. The ROK 1st Division and the U.S. 27th Regimental Combat Team stopped the main North Korean armored thrust there. By September 12th, the KPA was driven back. Their corps were reduced to maybe 60,000 men. Tank forces shattered.
And just at that moment, the entire strategic balance shifts.
Fundamentally. Because of MacArthur's bold move, the Incheon landing.
He really believed this is the only way.
He didn't think he could win without an amphibious landing deep behind enemy lines. He'd been planning it since July, picking the 1st Marine Division and the 8th Army's 7th Infantry Division as the core of his landing force, X-Corps.
And he chose Incheon, despite all the risks.
Oh, the risks were huge. The tides there have massive variance. Mines are expected, island, shoal waters. Plus, it was dangerously close to potential KPA reinforcements from Seoul.
But MacArthur insisted.
Brushed off all concerns. Convinced his audacious plan was the key.
How did the landing itself go?
After naval gunfire and air bombardment on September 14th, the Marines assaulted Wolmi Island, a key defense point, the next day. Then took Incheon itself later that afternoon.
Was resistance heavy?
Stubborn, but thinly spread. The North Koreans were caught off guard. The 1st Marine Division, along with RK and U.S. Army units, pushed inland and entered Seoul on September 25th.
And MacArthur declared South Korea liberated.
He and Syngman Rhee marched into the damaged Capitol building, made the declaration. It was a huge moment.
A tactical masterpiece, really. Fundamentally shifted the war.
It did. As an organized field force, the KPA just disintegrated. They lost 13,000 prisoners, maybe 50,000 casualties in August and September alone.
But not all were captured or killed.
No. About 25,000 of their best troops managed to retreat north through the mountains as cohesive units, and another 10,000 or so remained in the south as partisans, which would cause problems later.
And the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
It wasn't clean, was it? More atrocities.
Sadly, yes. The retreat exposed the brutal reality again. As the communists headed north, they took thousands of South Koreans with them hostages, forced laborers, and they executed thousands more.
Like at Taizhen again.
Yes, over 1,500 people massacred there, including civilians and U.S. and South Korean POWs. But the RKA and National Police, on their side, showed little sympathy for any suspected Southern communists they found, and U.S. aircraft attacked with little restraint sometimes.
The sources say late September saw atrocities rivaling those seen in Europe during the 30 Years' War.
A horrifying comparison, but it reflects the brutality of that moment.
So even before Incheon, MacArthur was already planning to go north.
He was planning a campaign into North Korea, aiming for a line between Pyongyang and Wonsan.
And he got the green light.
On September 27th, the Joint Chiefs gave him final authority to operate north of the 38th parallel. But there's that critical caveat.
Like limit operations if Russia or China intervened. A big if.
A huge if. Then, on October 7th, the UN General Assembly actually expanded the war aim to include occupying all of North Korea, eliminating the KPA as a threat, and reconstructing Korea as one nation.
Wow. So the initial defensive war to save South Korea.
Transformed into an offensive one, aiming for total unification by force.
And the advance began.
RK units crossed the parallel on October 1st. U.S. Army units followed on October 7th. The ROKI Corps raced up the East Coast, took Wonsan. Pyongyang fell to the U.S. I Corps on October 19th.
Where did the North Korean government go?
Kim Il-sung's government, with the remnants of maybe 9 KPA divisions, fell back to Ganggi, a mountain town near the Chinese border. 2 other divisions, with Soviet advisors and air defense units, struggled northwest towards the Yalu River.
But the UNC thought the KPA was finished.
They largely assumed the KPA had lost its will to fight. But the sources indicate, in reality, they were awaiting rescue.
A massive miscalculation.
A miscalculation that would directly invite a new, far more dangerous player onto the stage.
China.
Exactly. And just as UN forces thought victory was maybe finally within reach, China enters the fray.
Their entry didn't just escalate things. It fundamentally transformed the entire conflict, didn't it?
Yeah.
Leading to that brutal stalemate later on.
Completely changed the game. As UNC troops crossed the 38th parallel, Chinese Communist Party chairman Mao Zedong got that direct plea for military aid from Kim Il-sung.
Was Mao immediately willing?
He was willing to intervene, but he had conditions. He needed assurances of Soviet air power.
And Stalin agreed.
Stalin saw an opportunity, perhaps, to bleed the U.S. without direct, large-scale Soviet troop involvement. He promised to extend China's air defenses manned by Soviets, mind you, into a corridor over the Yalu River.
Protecting what?
Protecting air bases in Manchuria, crucial hydroelectric plants on the river. He also promised new Soviet weapons and helped building armaments factories for China.
So after some internal debate in China,
Mao ordered the Renminzi-Yuanjun, the Chinese People's Volunteers Force, or CPVF, commanded by General Peng Dehuai, to cross into Korea. Secretly at first.
this is huge. It escalates the conflict dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. It transforms it from this, localized civil war, albeit with international backing, into the ultimate Cold War proxy battle.
A template for future conflict.
Exactly. Superpowers clashing indirectly. It wasn't just about Korea anymore. It was a full-blown proxy fight, China stepping in to directly challenge the UN forces.
And the first clash was a shock to the UNC, the Chinese first offensive.
A massive shock. October 25th to November 6th, 1950, the objective was limited initially. Test the fighting quality of the U.S. and ROK troops and slow down their advance towards the Yalu.
And they succeeded.
And then some. At the Battle of Onjing-Unsan along the Chuncheon River, the Chinese basically ruined several Korean and U.S. regiments.
What were their tactics?
Very effective tactics. Attacking at night, infiltrating and cutting off supply and withdrawal routes, ambushing any counterattacking forces, and using concealment and cover incredibly well. Masters of camouflage.
What were the casualties like?
The Chinese took losses themselves, maybe 10,000 casualties, but they were convinced their methods worked. The UNC, on the other hand, was stunned. By the suddenness, the ferocity, they took nearly 8,000 casualties, 6,000 of them Koreans.
So the 8th Army pulled back.
Fell back, tightened its overextended lines, and winter was setting in, supplies were short. Pausing the advance was probably wise strategically, but it was definitely a pause born of shock.
Imagine that feeling on the ground. Suddenly you're not just fighting North Koreans anymore.
But this massive, disciplined Chinese army using entirely new and terrifyingly effective tactics. A whole new war.
And it wasn't just on the ground. The air war escalated too, right? MiG-Alley?
Right. The appearance of these advanced Soviet jet fighters, the MiG-15s, over North Korea caused serious concern, often flown by Soviet pilots pretending to be Chinese or Korean.
And they were effective.
Very. In just 1 week, early November, these MiGs pretty much stopped most daytime bombing raids over North Korea.
What was the U.S. response?
The U.S. Air Force rushed a wing of its own top jet interceptor, the F-86 Sabre, to Japan. And that began this intense 2.5-year battle for air superiority.
Did the Sabres win that battle?
Largely, yes. The F-86s allowed the Far East Air Forces, the FAF, to conduct offensive air operations pretty much anywhere in North Korea. And crucially, they protected the 8th Army on the ground from communist air attacks.
But not perfectly. What about MiG-Alley?
Right. They could never provide perfect protection for the big B-29 bombers flying daylight raids into MiG Alley. That was a corridor in northwestern Korea where the MiGs fiercely defended the Yalu River bridges and dams. Lots of intense dogfights there.
So a technologically advanced air war heating up, with secret Soviet involvement.
Adding another layer of complexity and danger to the whole conflict.
And the FE-8 bombing campaign against North Korea.
It was relentless, attacking cities, towns. The sources say they went up in flames, comparing the destruction to Hiroshima or Tokyo after World War II.
But did it stop the Chinese buildup?
Devastating as it was, no. It did not halt the Chinese buildup for their next big push, the Second Offensive.
Which led into that brutal winter retreat.
A really bleak period. MacArthur, in what some historians call his only real military mistake of the war, ordered the 8th Army and X-Corps northward again right into a Chinese trap late November 1950.
And the second Chinese offensive hit hard.
November 25th to December 14th, 420,000 Chinese and North Korean regulars just battered the UNC forces, pushed them all the way back into South Korea again.
The retreat from the Chosin Reservoir is famous, isn't it?
Infamous, maybe. The Chinese 9th Army Group sent 2 armies against the U.S. 1st Marine Division near the Qingjin Reservoir chosen to the Americans.
Horrific conditions.
Unbelievably cold, brutal weather. The Marines fought their way south, basically destroying 7 Chinese divisions in the process, before reaching safety at the port of Hanam on December 11th. An epic fighting retreat.
And the main 8th Army under General Walker?
Also retreated all the way back towards Seoul, destroying equipment and supplies they couldn't carry. Walker's initiative might have saved his army from complete envelopment, but it meant much of the rest of the war would be fought trying to recapture ground they'd just surrendered.
And then Walker himself died.
Tragically, yes. Died in a traffic accident just north of Seoul on December 23rd. He was succeeded by Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway.
So this huge swing from confident offensive to desperate retreat, the impact must have been massive.
Profound impact on morale, on strategy. It really demonstrated the brutal effectiveness of the Chinese tactics and the serious dangers of overextension for the UNC.
And Mao was encouraged by this success.
Very much so. Heartened by how easily the Chinese had driven the UNC out of North Korea, Mao actually expanded his war aims. Now he demanded the Chinese army unify all of Korea.
His enthusiasm grew with the Third Offensive.
Yes, December 31st, 1950 to January 5th, 1951. They retook Seoul again. These attacks largely hit Araka divisions, which were showing signs of, well, defeatism and sometimes ineptness after the long retreat.
So Ridgway had to rely on U.S. troops.
Heavily on his U.S. divisions. And many of those now included contingents from other UN nations. It was becoming a truly multinational force on the ground.
Which countries?
Turkey, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Greece, Colombia, Thailand, Ethiopia, the Philippines. A real coalition effort under the UN flag.
And Ridgway managed to push back.
He did. Successfully pushed back to the Han River Valley by late January 51, stabilized the front line, at least temporarily.
But the seesaw kept going. The Fourth Offensive.
February 11th, 1951, the Chinese, now reinforced by a reborn North Korean army, hit again. Same pattern initially struck ill-prepared South Korean divisions. UNC gave ground.
But fought back again.
Yes. Once again, the 8th Army fought back methodically. 2 months of intense combat, and they crossed the 38th parallel again.
It's exhausting just hearing about it. And then the Fifth Offensive.
Right. The first phase of that hit at a really awkward moment for the 8th Army Command.
Why awkward?
Because on April 11th, Truman fired MacArthur.
For insubordination.
Pretty much. Decided MacArthur's public disagreements and independent actions amounted to insubordination. Relieved him of all his commands, recalled him to the States.
Which put Ridgway in overall command.
Elevated Ridgway to Commander-in-Chief of Far East Command and UNC. And Lieutenant General James A. Van Fleet took command of the 8th Army on the ground.
So command changes happening right as the Chinese attack again.
Exactly. Before Van Fleet could fully get his feet under him, reorganize the RKA, redeploy divisions, the Chinese struck hard. Again, a battered RKA corps gave way, forcing U.S. divisions to peel back to protect their flanks.
How did Van Fleet stop it?
Had to commit 5 more U.S. and Korean divisions, plus a British brigade, to finally halt the Chinese advance around April 28th.
But Mao wasn't done.
No. Peng, the Chinese commander, reported his forces were weakened, couldn't sustain the offensive, but Mao refused to accept it. Ordered the second phase of the offensive.
When was that?
Began on May 16th, lasted another bloody week.
And the result?
Once again, Allied air power and heavy artillery stiffened the UNC resistance. And once again, the UNC crossed the 38th parallel in pursuit of a battered but still very potent Chinese army.
This constant back and forth, the immense casualties, crossing the 38th parallel over and over. It just underscores the brutal, grinding nature of this war once China got involved.
Absolutely. And it raises that profound question, doesn't it? At what point does trying to achieve military victory become just too costly, economically and, more importantly, humanly?
It's a heavy question, and it takes us right into the next phase, doesn't it? The war of attrition, the negotiating table, as this brutal stalemate starts to set in.
A realization dawns on both sides.
By June 1951, the war had reached another critical point. You had these huge armies facing each other.
Massive numbers. The Chinese North Korean forces, despite taking maybe 500,000 casualties since November, had actually grown to 1.2 million soldiers.
And the UNC.
They'd taken heavy casualties too, over 100,000 since China intervened, but their forces had also grown. By May 51, U.S. ground troops numbered around 256,000. The Yoruba had rebuilt to 500,000, and other Allied contingents added another 28,000.
Air power.
The U.S. FEA had also grown significantly. Fewer than 700 aircraft back in July 50, now over 1,400 by February 51.
So these massive forces, the huge losses, it forces a rethink.
It forces leaders on both sides to consider that peace probably couldn't be imposed by either side through military victory anymore, at least not at an acceptable cost.
Truman and the UN lost their appetite for unifying Korea by force.
Their ardor definitely cooled. They became much more focused on just getting back to the status quo before the war, the status quo antebellum, and increasingly sympathetic to the idea of a negotiated settlement.
The U.S. policy actually shifted formally.
Yes, May 17, 1951. The National Security Council adopted a new policy, still committed the U.S. to support a unified democratic Korea eventually, but crucially, not necessarily one unified by military action and overthrowing Kim Il-sung right now.
A significant shift away from forced unification. What about the communist side?
Well, the road to negotiations started in Beijing. Mao was initially reluctant to end the war, but he eventually approved a strategy suggested by Peng and others.
What was that strategy?
Basically, hold the ground they had in Korea. Conduct a war of attrition, aim for limited victories against smaller Allied units through violent night attacks, infantry infiltration, dig in, use caves and bunkers to counter UNC air and artillery power.
And meanwhile, start talking.
Yes. The Chinese would manage the negotiations. They saw it as an unparalleled chance to appear as an equal to the United States on the world stage, especially in Asia.
But the sources note something quite stark here about the Koreans themselves in these talks.
Tragically, yes. The Koreans were not a factor for either side in these high-level strategic decisions and negotiations. It's a pretty damning assessment of how the major powers viewed the conflict.
How did the actual talks get started? Was there Soviet involvement?
Yes, after some secret meetings between U.S. and Soviet diplomats, the Soviets publicly announced they wouldn't block a negotiated settlement. That was a key signal.
So the U.S. felt they could proceed.
The Truman administration had already alerted Ridgway to the possibility. On June 30th, Ridgway issued a public statement saying he was authorized to discuss an armistice, a cessation of hostilities.
And the Chinese and North Koreans agreed.
They issued a joint statement agreeing to meet, yes, but only at their chosen location, Gyeonggi.
Which was significant.
Very. An ancient Korean capital, once part of South Korea, but now occupied by the communists right on the front lines. It was the first symbolic move in a new kind of war, talking and fighting simultaneously.
This talking and fighting period, it lasted a long time, didn't it? July 51 right through to July 53.
2 full years. And calling it a stalemate is only accurate in a limited sense.
How so?
Well, yes, both sides had given up trying to unify Korea by force, and yes, the massive, fluid movements of armies seen in the first year were over.
But the fighting didn't stop.
Far from it. The political and geographic stakes in Korea remained incredibly high, which fueled intense, bloody, localized battles even while the negotiators were talking.
Ridgway and Van Fleet didn't trust the talks alone.
Neither of them believed the talks at Kaeching would produce anything meaningful without more UNC offensives putting pressure on the communists. Ridgway especially wanted to take the Iron Triangle.
A key strategic area.
Yes, between the headwaters of the Injin River and the high eastern mountain ranges. Both sides saw control of that terrain as crucial for defending North Korea or for potentially launching new offensives south.
So ground combat continued fiercely in 51.
Never really ceased. But nothing matched the ferocity and, frankly, the frustration of the 8th Army's autumn offensive, August 31st to November 12th.
That's when those infamous place names emerged.
Exactly. Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, the Punch Bowl, names that became symbols of the brutal, close quarters fighting for seemingly insignificant hills. Kim Il-sung had even issued a stand-or-die order to his KPA forces, which were much larger and better equipped by then.
What was the cost of that offensive?
Sobering. 60,000 casualties for the UNC, 22,000 of them American. Communist losses were also very high, maybe 100,000 to 150,000. Significant, but not crippling. Not enough to force the Chinese to end the war, just enough to make them keep talking, perhaps.
So talking and fighting was incredibly costly in human lives. Political objectives driving military action even when total victory was off the table.
Precisely. And it was during this period, late October 51, that the communists agreed to move the truce talks.
To where? To a more secure, neutral area. The village of Panmunjom. That's the place that would become famous.
Did things move faster there?
Somewhat. Within about 2 months, both sides accepted the current line of contact between the armies as the basis for the military demarcation line, the MDL. And they agreed on related measures, like creating a demilitarized zone, the DMZ.
Any concessions?
The UNC accepted that there wouldn't be verification activities outside the DMZ. Both sides agreed to work on enforcement mechanisms for the armistice. So the outline of an agreement started to emerge by the end of 1951. But there was one massive sticking point.
One major intractable issue remained: the handling of prisoners of war, POWs.
This became the central issue blocking the armistice for a long time.
Absolutely. As another freezing Korean winter settled in, the repatriation of POWs became the most difficult issue at Panmunjom.
What was the standard procedure expected?
Well, the initial assumption was to follow the revised Geneva Convention of 1949, which seemed to require all-for-all exchange, complete, even forced repatriation of all prisoners.
Who favored that?
The U.S. military leadership actually favored all for all, partly due to those early reports of atrocities against Allied POWs. They wanted their men back.
But not everyone agreed.
No. The South Korean government was adamantly opposed to involuntary repatriation. They knew thousands of the detainees held by the UNC were actually ROK citizens who'd been forced to fight for the KPA. They didn't want them sent north against their will.
The Chinese.
The Chinese army leaders knew that some of their soldiers, particularly those who had been part of the defeated nationalist army and were then impressed into the communist forces, would likely refuse repatriation if it wasn't mandatory.
So a really complex web of political and personal factors.
Deeply complex. And then came the exchange of names and numbers held. That shocked everyone.
How so? The numbers didn't match.
Drastically. The U.S. military listed about 11,500 men as missing in action, but the communists reported holding only 3,198 Americans, plus about 1,200 other UNC personnel, mostly British and Turkish.
It's a huge discrepancy. What about the South Koreans?
Even worse, the ROK estimated 88,000 MIAs. The communists listed only 7,142 names.
That must have fueled terrible fears about what happened to the missing.
It absolutely fueled Allied fears that the murder rate of POWs had been even higher than suspected. The reality, according to the sources, is that most MIAs had died in battle, but perhaps as many as 15,000 mostly South Koreans had died in communist hands. From torture, execution, starvation, medical mistreatment, a grim reality.
Did the communists have concerns about the numbers too?
They did. The UNC list showed about 132,000 communist personnel in their custody. North Koreans, Chinese, and also South Koreans captured fighting for the North. But the UNC also reported that around 40,000 initially listed as missing from their count were actually South Koreans who had passed loyalty checks and wouldn't be repatriated to the North anyway.
So against this backdrop of suspicion, missing men, and forced conscripts, Truman makes a crucial decision.
January 1952. Truman rules that no POW in UNC custody would be forced to return to North Korea or China against his will. Voluntary repatriation.
Which sounds principled, but dramatically complicated the negotiations.
Massively. It required extensive individual screening of prisoners to determine their preferences.
And this led to violence within the POW camps.
Immediately, open warfare broke out inside the wire. The communists had infiltrated political officers into the UNC camps. Orders came from Pujang: obstruct the screening process, even if it costs lives.
What was their goal?
To make the POW seem so unruly, so difficult, that the UNC would give up on voluntary repatriation and just force everyone back to communist control to end the chaos.
So there were actual battles inside the camps.
Starting December 51, a series of revolts. culminating in pitched battles between armed prisoners using makeshift weapons and entire UNC Guard battalions. Hundreds of POWs died, and some UNC troops, too. It was incredibly violent.
How did the UNC regain control?
Finally, in May 1952, General Mark W. Clark, who had just replaced Ridgway as the UNC commander, ordered Operation Breakup.
What did that involve?
Over the next few months, they used tanks, tear gas, and sometimes live fire to crush the revolt. By year's end, all the Chinese prisoners were moved to a separate island, Jeju Island. Repatriates and non-repatriates were segregated. Camp administration improved, but vigilantism and gang violence among the prisoners never entirely stopped.
This whole POW issue, it's just staggering. The human cost, the moral complexity.
It really highlights the profound human dimension of the war. It wasn't just armies clashing. The fate of individual soldiers became the central, incredibly contentious bargaining chip in international diplomacy, pushing the boundaries.
And beyond the main front lines and the negotiating table at Panmunjom, there were these other wars being fought simultaneously, weren't there?
Yes, several layers of conflict happening. One was a brutal guerrilla war continuing in the south.
Communist partisans.
Yes, and stay-behind units of the KPA, based in the mountainous southern provinces of South Korea. They plagued UNC supply lines, rear area camps, Korean towns.
How did the UNC respond to that?
In the autumn of '51, Van Fleet ordered Major General Paik Sun-yup, a very effective RK officer, to basically break the back of this guerrilla activity.
Was it successful?
The campaign from December '51 to March '52 was ruthlessly effective. RK security forces killed nearly 11,100 partisans and sympathizers, captured almost 10,000 more.
That ratio sounds grim.
The sources suggest it indicates something close to a scorched earth, no quarter policy. And previous ARCA counter-guerrilla operations had already resulted in atrocities like the execution of 800 to 1,000 villagers at Kuchang back in February '51.
These other wars just reveal more layers of brutality and desperation.
A total war approach in many ways, with immense suffering inflicted on civilians, often far from the main battle lines.
And then there was the ongoing air war.
Intense air warfare. Air power was really the UNC's greatest advantage against Chinese manpower and their increasing firepower on the ground.
The battle for air superiority continued. F-86s versus MiG-15s.
Yes, the FEA clearly won that battle overall. Fewer than 100 F-86 Sabres were pitted against much larger numbers of MiGs flown by Soviets, Chinese, and North Koreans.
What were the kill ratios like?
U.S. pilots downed at least 500 MiGs for a loss of 78 Sabres. The Soviets rotated their squadrons through, reportedly losing over 200 pilots in MiG Alley, a heavy price for them, too.
And the strategic bombing of North Korea continued.
Yes, initially limited to cities and military installations. Pursued until, as we mentioned, Pyongyang looked like Hiroshima or Tokyo.
Then the targets expanded.
In 1952, bombing power plants and dams along the Yalu was authorized. The next year, 1953, approval was given to attack irrigation dams vital for agriculture in North Korea.
Did this bombing have the desired strategic effect?
It caused immense suffering for North Korean civilians, undoubtedly. But the sources suggest it had little real impact on Chinese or Russian strategic decisions about continuing the war. It raises serious questions about the efficacy versus the cost of that kind of bombing.
Was the nuclear option ever seriously considered?
It was studied seriously by U.S. political and military leaders 4 separate times during the war.
And the conclusion?
Always the same. The existing atomic bombs, carried by modified B-29s, would be devastating against cities, but likely have little tactical effect on the dispersed communist forces in the field.
Truman mentioned it once publicly.
In December 1950, he suggested he was considering it. That prompted a swift backlash, led by the British and other allies who feared it would escalate the conflict into World War III. They shut that talk down quickly.
The air campaign definitely hurt the communists, though. How did they retaliate against captured pilots?
With special brutality, according to the sources. Captured air crewmen made up the largest single group of U.S. POWs who simply disappeared. Presumed dead under interrogation in Manchuria, maybe elsewhere in China, possibly even in Russia.
And the communists made accusations against the UNC air campaign.
Yes, they mounted a huge propaganda campaign claiming Fegeleif bombers were deliberately spreading epidemic diseases, germ warfare. They tortured captured American pilots until they extracted forced confessions about terror bombing and germ warfare, a really ugly aspect of the war.
While all this is happening internationally and militarily, what about the political situation within South Korea?
Significant tensions there, too. On the one hand, the U.S. Korean Military Advisory Group, KMAG, was working hard to modernize the RKA, improve its training, making it a more effective fighting force.
But dealing with Syngman Rhee was difficult.
Always difficult. The sources describe him as convinced he had an unfinished divine mission to save Korea, meaning unify it under his rule. He was aging, but still very determined.
He made a power grab in 1952.
Yes, forced the National Assembly to change the Constitution so the president would be elected by popular vote, not by the Assembly, then immediately called an election and won a second term overwhelmingly.
And this impacted the armistice talks.
Definitely. Rhee's political coup stiffened his dogmatic opposition to any ceasefire short of unification. He just couldn't believe that the incoming Republican administration in the U.S., Eisenhower and Dulles, would really settle for a tie. He thought they'd fight on.
So internal politics in the South adding another layer of complexity to ending the war.
Yep.
Driven by these strong personalities.
Absolutely. Rhee's resistance was a major obstacle in the final phases.
Which brings us to that bitter end and the enduring legacy, the final offensives.
Right. From September to November 1952, the Chinese staged their sixth major offensive of the war.
What was the goal this time?
Seems to have been twofold. Try to force the Allies back towards the 38th parallel again and inflict unacceptable casualties, perhaps to influence the upcoming U.S. election or deter future UNC offensives.
Was the fighting pattern the same?
Pretty much the same dismal pattern. Chinese infiltrate Allied outposts at night, attack under intense but short artillery barrages, close quarters, combat submachine guns, grenades, flamethrowers, demolitions. Standard assault tactics by then.
More obscure hills got memorable names.
White Horse Mountain, Bunker Hill, Old Baldy, Triangle Hill, sites of incredibly ferocious, costly fighting for small tactical gains.
What were the casualties in this offensive?
By mid-November, when the fighting faded, the Eighth Army had lost another 10,000 men. The Chinese, perhaps 15,000? Chinese commanders hoped they'd maybe persuaded President-elect Eisenhower to abandon any plans for a major UNC offensive in 1953.
This just shows the brutal, static nature of the war by then. Fighting for inches, trying to gain leverage at the negotiating table at immense cost.
Exactly. Pure attrition warfare.
But the geopolitical sands were shifting dramatically elsewhere.
Big shifts were happening. Both Eisenhower, the president-elect, and his incoming Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, viewed continuing the Korean War as, well, incompatible with broader U.S. national security interests.
Why?
They saw the People's Republic of China as the main adversary in Asia, but Korea was only one theater in that larger Cold War struggle. Plus, they knew public support for the war back home had worn thin after years of talking and fighting and the costs involved.
Did they signal any flexibility on the negotiations, particularly POWs?
Yes. Dulles conceded the communist point that voluntary repatriation should involve screening by a neutral international agency, not just USRO teams. That was a key concession.
And there was a goodwill gesture proposed.
The UN and the International Red Cross called for an exchange of sick and disabled POWs first. Eisenhower approved this, seeing it as a good test of communist intentions.
And then, the biggest geopolitical shift of all.
By sheer chance, Joseph Stalin died, March 5, 1953.
And that was the critical turning point.
It seems to have been decisive. Within weeks, the Soviet Politburo in Moscow voted that the war in Korea should be ended.
How did Mao react?
With dismay, reportedly. He knew his army couldn't continue the war at that intensity without crucial Soviet military and economic assistance, which the new Soviet leadership seemed less willing to provide indefinitely.
This really highlights how external events, even one leader's death, can just dramatically alter a seemingly intractable conflict.
It's a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of global politics. With surprising speed after Stalin's death, the Chinese accepted the principle of voluntary repatriation, mediated by a neutral agency.
So the main logjam was broken.
POWs who wanted to return home would be released immediately. Those who chose not to return would go into the custody of a neutral international agency. Eventually, India agreed to lead this for non-coercive screening. They also agreed to that exchange of sick and disabled POWs, which happened in April and May 1953.
So peace seemed finally within reach. But not quite yet. Syngman Rhee was still a factor.
A major factor. Rhee never publicly gave up his March North and Unify stance. In private, he hinted he'd only accept an armistice if the U.S. made serious commitments.
What kind of commitments?
An unambiguous mutual security treaty guaranteeing U.S. defense of South Korea and substantial economic aid, he mentioned, $1 billion.
And the Chinese launched one more offensive.
Yes, their seventh and final major offensive, opened in May '53, partly to gain more territory before the ceasefire, partly perhaps to pressure Rhee and the Americans. They hit the South Koreans hard again, driving them back about 30 kilometers from the Kumsong salient. That battle essentially ended the major shooting war.
But Rhee had one more act of defiance.
A dramatic one. On June 18th and 19th, he arranged for his military police to essentially allow 27,000 anti-communist North Korean POWs held in RK camps to just escape, walk away.
How did the other sides react?
It enraged both the Chinese, who ordered more attacks specifically targeting RKA units in retaliation, and the Americans, who felt Rhee was jeopardizing the entire peace process.
How was it resolved?
Ultimately, the U.S., through intense diplomacy, convinced Rhee that they would meet his preconditions for an armistice. The security treaty, the aid. On July 9th, Rhee finally agreed to accept the armistice, though critically,
No representative of the Republic of Korea ever signed the agreement.
never signed it, which raises that important question. What does it mean for an armistice to be signed by the military commanders, including North Korea and China, but not by one of the primary governments involved, South Korea? What does that imply for lasting peace?
A question that still hangs over the peninsula today.
Absolutely. So on July 27th, 1953, General Mark Clark for the UNC, Peng Dehuai for the Chinese volunteers, and Kim Il-sung for North Korea signed the armistice agreement at Panmunjom.
And the shooting stopped.
That same day, the shooting largely stopped. The armies began the awkward, tense process of pulling back from the final line of contact, creating that 4-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone, the DMZ.
Who supervised the armistice?
A complex structure. A military armistice commission, MAC, with members from both sides, a neutral nations supervisory commission, NNSC, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, Czechoslovakia, meant to monitor compliance outside the DMZ, though its effectiveness was limited.
And for the POWs who hadn't been repatriated yet?
A neutral nations repatriation commission, NNRC, comprising the same 4 NNSC states plus India, which acted as the custodian for the prisoners who hadn't chosen repatriation yet.
The main POW exchange happened quickly.
Yes. August 5th to September 6th became a huge media event. Over 75,000 communist soldiers and civilians went north. About 13,000 UNC personnel, ROK soldiers, Americans, other nationalities returned to UNC control.
But handling the non-repatriates was difficult.
A nightmare for the NNRC, especially the Indian troops acting as guards. Communist agents among the POWs continued to cause trouble, trying to coerce people to return north.
What was the final outcome for them?
By February 1954, after the screening period, only 628 Chinese and Koreans had changed their minds and chosen to go north. Nearly 22,000 remained under UNC control. Most eventually settled in South Korea or were sent to Taiwan.
The complexity of that whole POW saga and then the failure of the political conference,
Yeah.
it just highlights the deep wounds left unhealed.
Totally unhealed. The armistice agreement called for a political conference to discuss Korea's future. The U.S. organized one in Geneva in 1954 involving all the belligerents.
And the result.
The sources simply say it produced no agreement, none whatsoever.
So the Korean Peninsula remained divided.
Caught in the coils of Cold War rivalry. The front line established by the armistice became the de facto boundary, accepted ever since, but never formalized by a peace treaty.
But the outcome, at least, was the survival of South Korea.
Yes, the Republic of Korea survived, which, the sources argue, kept alive the hope, however distant, for eventual civil liberties, democracy, economic development, and maybe someday, unification. Even if that fulfillment might take another 50 years or more, as one source put it back then, we're past that 50 years now.
So the Korean War ended by an armistice, but never truly resolved by peace. A powerful symbol of the Cold War, the human cost of ideology.
And what's fascinating, as you said, is how this temporary measure, the DMZ, this line drawn in battle, became such a permanent scar on the landscape, an unfinished war.
Right. So we've journeyed from the ashes of Japanese occupation through this brutal civil war fueled and then dominated by global superpowers. We've witnessed the shifting strategies, the unbelievable human cost.
And landed on an armistice that stopped the shooting but never truly brought peace. You've seen how those internal Korean aspirations clashed violently with international proxy battles, leading to a division that defines the fate of millions even today.
It's often called the Forgotten War, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially in some parts of the West. But as you've heard throughout this deep dive, its impact was anything but forgettable, and its consequences are absolutely still alive.
Very much so.
So what does this all mean for us today? What's the final takeaway for you listening?
Well, considering that the armistice was never formally converted into a peace treaty, and that one of the primary combatants, South Korea, never even signed it, how truly over is the Korean War?
Right.
And maybe more importantly, what profound lessons does this unfinished war hold for current geopolitical tensions, for the pursuit of lasting peace in a world that's still grappling, in many ways, with deep ideological divides and great power competition?
It's a heavy question, something to ponder long after this deep dive concludes.